everyone, welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today is part 2 of drawing the German Landsknecht cat. Today we're going to be drawing the clothes. As always, I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here is the German Landsknecht cat. They're pretty crazy. It actually took me an entire day to sketch this out. So all of these stripes are, they tended to have slices through their clothes all the way through. So it's a different fabric in between these. I'm going to do that in red. So the top layer we're going to do in yellow, bottom in red, all the way through is clothing. And then the feathers, we're going to have matching that as red and yellow as well. The hat I'm going to do is brown along with the belt. And he's got little like stockings that come down to about here that are also alternately striped. So there's a whole lot happening. And that's kind of how the German Landsknechts like it. So we're going to start with the yellow. And this is just a sketching step. Especially with so much going on, need to be able to sort out what's happening and where it's going. So, right, this is just clothing, so we're going to have some of it going this way, have it coming down, and just long sort of stripes. Mix the red in after we get this done. It shouldn't be, and the little lapel thing is going to be in yellow as well. But the shirt underneath, well, he's got a white little fringe thing, because they did at the time do that sometimes. And so that'll be white, and then here I've been debating on brown or red, and I'm probably going to do it in red. Right, so just kind of big sweeps because, you know, it is just a sketching step, but we can fill in some of this because this part isn't all that difficult. You know, on the torso, this is where the lines are all going. The difference being when you get over here towards the arm, because it's going to twist, right? As we come over here, these lines change direction because now the arm is kind of scooting out to the side to hold the Zweihander. And so making sure all of that makes sense. So right, the sketching steps just to make sure I get everything in there without any line conflicts. Line conflicts, unfortunately, are certainly a thing that can easily happen if you're not careful. So making sure, you know, that it doesn't have any line conflicts. Now, you know, you don't, when there's a gap, and we'll have some gaps because of the way the clothing, right? Like this is an actual gap where this bit of the arm is blocking the bottom bit. And so in those cases, we don't have to keep the lines continuous because we wouldn't see it. But elsewhere we certainly would. Now luckily it's easy enough, I'm going to say this and then jinx myself, but it's easy enough to kind of get a feel for what's what and where the red is supposed to be versus where the yellow is supposed to be, to know exactly where it should be, and I'm not getting myself confused over my drawing, because sometimes if you make something too complicated, and I've done this many a time, it can be confusing when you start drawing it out. You know, there's so many lines, it's hard to remember what line was denoting what sort of change when I'm sketching. But with the Landsknechts, I don't know that we have that problem, although I'm a little confused as to what I was doing here. I'm fairly certain this is what's going to have to be. This certainly Alright, and then it comes to kind of a, not a cuff, but the edge of the garment here. You can see here we don't have to match that up, as that's just going through as it runs into his arm. There's so many sketch layers, it's going to be hard for me to take the sketch off and see how it's looking. I was just about to do it, and then I realized that there's a lot. It would take me a while to figure out which one this is. Which is also going to be important to make sure that I keep my layers straight and I don't mix up my drawing layers for anything else. So the little lapel, right, that's going to be a change of direction just a little bit, because it'll be following the angle of the lapel down, which will change how we're perceiving it. Most of the magic in this composition is going to happen, well, and that's true of most compositions, it happens in the highlights and the shadows. So, you know, we're going to add the yellow and the red and it'll look pretty flat until we add the highlights and shadows, and you'll really be able to see that the red is a layer under the yellow. And then whenever you have a belt like this, right, you have baggy shirt dipping up over a belt, like you want that to not be a straight line. It wouldn't be, because the clothing would bend and fold. And you want that reflected in how it's drawn. So when you come to an edge, it would have inevitably bends and folds in it. So I'm going to get the rest of the yellow drawn in, just on, you know, what we're doing. And I will be right back. I know I didn't get the feathers yet, but that's a separate scenario. He's looking like a dapper little kitty. Okay, so the red will go much quicker, and for now, we're just, you know, putting the red into those gaps. So that is just the stripes, shouldn't take too long. But in some cases, it's very close to edges. Now, it's not always close to an edge, which is nice. And because of how the stripes are done, it's not necessarily confusing. What I do need to make sure of, well, I'll have to figure that out if I need to, is that this is obviously a different layer of fabric, so it wouldn't be sticking out as far as the yellow. So I need to make sure I'm cutting in a bit, and I don't think I did it up here, so that's probably something we're going to have to fix. Only important, obviously, and where they're on the edge. For the most part, they're not, and so it won't really matter how it fills in. But anywhere it's on the edge, I need to be mindful that because it's type of fabric it is, it wouldn't necessarily be sticking out as far. That's the yellow's job. And I'm also going to do the shirt underneath in red here. It's tricky because of how I've drawn it. I might have to fix some of that with yellow, but should be easy to do. Right, so this one, right, tucking that in a bit from where it would be. Same with these, tucking that in a bit. Wouldn't be as far out. And then you have a ledge, right? So these don't have to line up because they're on ledges. And by that I mean like gaps in the clothing. Now their colors, you know, what the Landsknechts would do, you would have these very bright colors. It wasn't always this, you know, red and yellow, although it could be. They'd also mix in a lot of blues or white, but you would always have some bold, bright color because they were mercenaries, and they were dominating force on a battlefield for just over 100 years, right around 100 years. They could get away with it. It wasn't necessarily something that would have been acceptable socially at the time, but nobody was going to argue with, you know, the most fearsome mercenary group of their day. So they were able to have some bold fashion choices that other people would not be allowed to have. They used a variety of weapons. They were mostly known for using pikes and zweihanders. I've drawn this one with a zweihander, partly because I was worried if I drew a pike, you need so much room in the pike. The cat would be tiny in the composition because the pike would take up so much room. I mean, pikes are like, you know, 15 feet or whatever, so tall weapons. And you would use zweihanders, the giant two-handed swords, to go rushing in to break up opponent pike formations so that their pikemen could swoop in and cause some damage. It's one of the reasons I sketch it out, right, is there's moments where I'm drawing something in and I'm like, what have I done? What is this supposed to be? And animals that have really complicated, you know, fur patterns going kind of all over the place can get confusing when I'm adding color, trying to remember what's supposed to be what. Especially as you can see I've changed, when I was drawing it, I was changing how big these slices were. Especially if I make decisions and I don't fully erase a previous decision out of the way. Sometimes I'm like, what is this supposed to be? Oh, it's just the remnants of a previous decision. Easy enough to fix. Luckily. Well, that's why we're sketching it. After I do this, I'm going to see if I can pop this off and make sense of what I've done. Should be able to. I probably could have done it already because I bet the black would be distinguishable, but you want to make sure those edges are good. So another case, right, like I'm on the edge, so I need to come in just a little bit of where the red would be. And then down in here. And then the stockings. Just going to use the colors for my martial arts group, just Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts. We are, you know, the yellow color, this goldish yellow, and black. But I don't really want to draw black, so I've turned it into red. And the Landsknechts would have had bolder colors, so I have the dominating color being our Tirfa's group color, with the red is kind of that backup color underneath. I even thought about putting our logo on the cat's chest, but thought that might have been overkill. Okay, so I'm gonna go back and get this yellow real fast. I'll get the white ruffle real fast before I commit to taking that off. And this is just, you know, a little white ruffle. His chin and a little bit of his cheeks are going to be white too, so that should tie nicely to the ruffle. again with shadows and highlights, sort of helping to dictate what's what. Gonna have white whiskers, that's the only thing that might sort of blend in when we start doing it, but it should come out nicely. Right, just sort of going up and down. Same thing over here. Oh, that was some hard brush strokes. That's fine. I actually think he looks super cute for the moment. See if we keep that as we go. Okay. We can get the brown of the belt and the hilt and the hat. And so I have this brown sort of set aside. Relatively straightforward. Bottom part nice and straight. Top has the shirt, you know, that's pushing over it. So you just fill in those gaps. Otherwise straightforward. I mean, when you're drawing something like this, a belt like this, it's pretty straightforward. Careful on the edge though. Now for the hat. So this is, you know, the feathers are sort of lined up on top of the hat. So this little swoop's underneath. It'll be in shadow when we get to it. Of course, a good portion of the hat's going to be in shadow. Because you have all these feathers sticking out kind of everywhere. And the hat is just sort of behind it all. So we might have to add more to the hat when we're done. But for now, this is what we'll do. Right, all of this would be hat because it ends over here. Once again in shadow, so a good portion of the actual brown of the hat won't really be showing a whole lot. Just making sure you get all by the face. But otherwise, you know, like the others, pretty straightforward. Just dodging feather edges. Big, bold, fluffy feather edges. So at this point, I'm just going to kind of be choosing random feathers to be random things. So we're going to start with the yellow. Right, to do feathers, you typically just kind of have lines coming out on either side and some in the middle where they kind of meet there, right? So you're just nice and easy to do. And then as the feather turns, the lines inevitably turn. Especially on big, ridiculous feathers like this. This is a big, ridiculous feather. Entirely appropriate. Now, probably want a red one here. So let's do, this is red, let's have this be yellow. Ending out over here. So that means this will be red, red, red. We could probably have a couple of yellows lined up. No, Let's switch to red and see how it looks. Okay. So, red. And then, yeah, I guess this should still work. Red coming out over here. Just trying to balance the colors right. If something looks wrong, then I know that it's wrong. Alright. Yeah, okay. And then the highlights and shadows will do some to help as well. Okay, so he's all sketched out. Now it's a matter of adding the highlights and shadows. I'm going to have the light source coming from above and to the left. Right over here. Let me change my color real fast. We'll do the yellow clothing first. Right, light source coming from above and to the left. Always, as always, that means it's above and in front of, not behind or next to. And the reason I'm doing the left instead of the right, like I usually do, is he's turned just that little bit towards the left. So I want the best possible opportunity to really brighten up my subject, and that's going to give it the best opportunity because he's just that little bit turned. I'm going to save it and jump right in. Alright, I've decided to get the fur on the cat done first. I think that might help, especially because he doesn't look like he's having a good time right now, and I want to see if I can bring his little smirk back out. Okay, so with the light source coming from above and to the left, that means all of this is full pin pressure. And we're going to follow the lines we've already drawn. All edges are in shadow, right? So even once you get over here, right, all of this is in shadow. And that's just lighter pin pressure. So backing that off, it's a little harder to get some of those details with a smaller figure like this, partly because I don't change my brush size, which I've mentioned before, so in this particular case I'm using the same size brush but with less wiggle room. So all of this, but it's not going to be as deep as the shadow that'll be over here, right? So a little bit under the nostril too, right? You're going to have some of that in shadow under the nose. And then somewhere along here, I think it's, yeah, right here, we have the edge of his face. Okay, so now this is going to be full pin pressure through here, but tapering it off as we get to spots where we've added shadow. So we want that to blend in. And still following those lines. Once we add the white, that should actually potentially really help. Right, so then we have that strip of black here. I'm blending this in. And here. See, I back off my pin pressure and then sort of taper it in to make it look more natural. You gain a lot of ground pretty quickly when you're using full pin pressure, and especially if you're like me and you're not changing your brush size. You're going to gain a lot of ground here. Alright, so up in here. we can change the size of that stripe on his face. Just trying to highlight that there's a smirk there. The white will help too, but adding in just a little bit of highlight against the shadow right under here will make it look like a ledge, which will help make it look like he's smirking. Same thing here, there is some black by the eye, so we won't be filling that all the way in. And that full pin pressure. So again, being careful by the eye. Now under the eye would be in shadow, so right, the eye's rounding down, so there's going to be some shadowing there. Just like there is against the eye itself. And then going into highlight over here. Now, over here, same thing. I'm just checking the edge so I can do this. Right shadow against the face, rounding up, and then shadow underneath. And we'll make this, I can get rid of this, a little bit of a deeper shadow over here, as it would be turning away. His head's, you know, it would be rounding away from the light source, which is on the opposite side. So it's always a deeper shadow on that back side. So I'll pull this up and build it up just a little bit more. And then we can have some space to get the highlight in there, because there will be some, I want it hitting his cheek a bit. Usually what I do, maybe I should, is I get this whole side in shadow and then work out the highlight. That might be, whoop, huh. Don't get overzealous like me and just blasted through some, what should have been black. I guess, yeah, I did there, okay. I did here, and here, so I need to come in and remove it. And then under the hat, let me get this whole, some of this is going to be highlight, but I do find it easier to do shadow and then build highlight out, and the cheek will pick up highlight because it's pushing forward, so this wouldn't be in shadow, but it'll just be easier to do this. especially with his body so turned towards the light, there's going to be more of his face in highlight than usually when we do an animal portrait, potentially. It's not so turned. But if we fill this in just a little bit more, it'll give me a little bit more freedom. It's easier to add highlights than it is to take highlights away. So of all the scenarios, this is the easiest one to kind of make happen, is filling this in over here. And then the back side of the eye as well. I guess that can come down. And then the hat's going to be casting a shadow too. Just like the other side, right underneath the eye here, there's going to be some shadowing where that eyelid is rounding down into the eye before it picks up highlight. And then pulling this all the way over. Right, and so then you have the hat, so this would be shadow. Especially with the feathers coming down. I'm gonna give myself some room. And then it'll build in a little like runway for me to have some maneuverability. Okay. When we add in the highlights. Now, have some shadowing there. I probably would have some shadowing here. Probably just a little bit here, although there's some black there, so. And then you still have the hat, so some would be under here. And here on the back side of this ear, which is away from the light source. Okay, now, I think, okay, so, all edges are in shadow, so we have all of that, and of course these are going to be, it's almost like straps that are sticking out. Kind of almost did a shadow, it looks like on them anyway. But I'll make sure it's really there. And then of course there'd be a shadow under here against the belt. There's probably some wrinkling in the clothes, especially as it bulges and ripples over the belt. And some deep shadows over here. Now, because they're dipping down and coming back up, there will be some light catching on the back side of these. Right, so, you know, you'd have a highlight on an edge where it's coming out of a shadow. But I'm going to say you're probably dipping down a bit because of how that's looking. And then we'll push you into highlight. Right, and it'll create, when we add the shadows of the red, that should create a nice differentiation, right? So we'll have highlight going down. It's probably catching because they're little strips of clothing. And then being mindful of these, right? So this is probably a dip through here on the back side. And that probably might not go all the way up, so some of this could be highlight. Connecting into... We'll have a little bit of shadowing coming through here, so this is adding some texture to the clothing. Don't want it all perfectly highlights because it's wrinkly, especially this kind of baggier, floofy clothing that they would have had. Would have certainly had plenty of wrinkles. In some ways the style really helps with that, because you can kind of give a sense of it and it'll work. Okay. But there would be shadow, you know, on the back side. This would be shadow. Needs to stick up above the red. And, you know, his body's turned just that little bit, so some of this would be shadow. So, you know, when you're doing clothes, there'll be a lot of wrinkles in them, and you can kind of see, especially with the style, you can leave some gaps in how you're applying the highlights so that it has a more natural sort of wrinkled appearance. Now, as we start working our way over towards the right, his vest is going to go more and more in shadow, but there probably is still just a little bit of a burst on this side. Not going to be as much, but still in highlight, as this catches just on this side as it's fading out into shadow, but we'll temper that out, right? So we don't want that to be a big sudden dramatic change, but you know, we are starting to work our way over to where that would be tapering. And it's okay for bulges or whatever else to keep the shadow, especially on clothing, a little bit more uneven because of the nature of how that's working. You know, you have bulges and dips in the fabric, and that's going to create some changes. Whereas, you know, over here, solidly away from the highlights, so this side wouldn't necessarily be getting that burst of highlight. And then as we come to the arm's jutting forward, but not at first, so, you know, we'll have a little bit of shadowing through here before it really starts pushing forward. And then as it's pushing forward, it'll pick up that highlight. But this is still the shoulder, so this is still flush with right, his body. So there's some amount of shadowing that's potentially happening, although with the light source above and in front of, there's also still potentially some highlight more than I'm doing. But I like to, you know, as I said earlier, it's easier to add highlight than it is to take it away. So it's easier to do it in shadow and then sort out where your highlights would be than it is to do it in highlight and have to take it back. Now there's a bulge here in the sleeve, and that's going to be indicated through highlights and shadows, right? So we have an edge and this is going to be picking up just a little bit. And that edge, which I didn't do a good job of sketching as easily, but we can make the magic happen through highlights and shadows. That's usually how it goes. Right, this in shadow. Have this pick up a little bit. And then all of this back here in shadow. And back here. And then as we round under, of course, you know, you have the bottom of the fabric that would be in shadow. And you'd have this picking up highlight as it's pushed itself forward. We'll have a little bit there, but mostly that's shadow. And pushing that right up to the edge of the pommel. Not the pommel, the crossguard. And pommel. Like I've never even held a sword before. Alright. And then working our way down, right at first we have the body potentially blocking right where this is connecting in. But that's going to quickly be coming out. And allowing this to go a little bit in the shadow. I'm going to brighten up this highlight once I get it sort of situated. Just indicating that this is a bulge. And that because of how I sketched it, I'll have to do that through highlights and shadows. Usually you would anyway, but it's easier to see when you sketch it a little better than what I did. And then right underneath, you have the shadowing. Maybe some highlights through here. But with it rounding under, that's going to be changing. And remembering, the fabric having some manner of wrinkles. So intermixing your shadows so it's not a nice uniform highlight. Okay. Now, we'll brighten this up. Make sure that this is nice and bright so it indicates there's a it's raising up. That there's a bulge, just like there's a bulge here. That's what the highlights and shadows are doing. But that would have a little bit. Maybe a little bit here on the shoulder. And then having that look like it's bulging in interesting ways, right? So if we back out, you get the sense that it's his sleeve sort of pushing forward. And then we'll keep working on this, right? So we have that harsher highlight against the edge of the where it's dipping, where there's slices in the shirt, and sort of looking at how things look and make sense of exactly what we're doing to create wrinkling. And this is just kind of, getting a feel for where you think shadows would be, where you think wrinkles would be, and adjusting accordingly. And this side, as opposed to the other, you're going to have more of that highlight on the shoulder, with just a little bit of shadowing. And I gave him a little bit of a collar, so I'm going to get a little bit of that in there too. Now, same thing over here. It's going to have some wrinkling to it, and some highlights in between. Sometimes, if you're too close, I find it harder to get a sense for what's happening, especially when you're adding wrinkles to clothing. You kind of do need a bigger picture. Still adding that burst of highlight against that side, right, where the red is dipping in. So you still always want to make sure that that is catching light here. Basically coming out of a recess. It's the same thing we do when we're drawing like the pupils in an eye. You would add a burst of light on the opposite side of the light source against a recess, or like a cup if you're drawing a cup. the side opposite the light source would be picking up the highlight. Right, some shadowing here because it's dipping in and then it's dipping back out. So again, those bursts of light. And then shadowing kind of up and down throughout. This a little trickier because of where it is. It should be rounding in. And then this is sort of rounding away in an interesting way. Now light source above, right? So this is the side that would get that burst of light. I mean, and it's not that it wouldn't be getting some highlight on the other, but because that other side's dipping in, it won't be getting quite as much. Right, we have another burst come in, but we're running that burst into a ledge. So the ledge of the clothing, where there's a fold. So all edges in shadow, and the fold is rounding into the body over here, but there would still be some burst. So we push it into the body, backing off that pin pressure. All of this under here in shadow. And then the shadow into the body. And cleaning up this down here a bit from where I drew it. Okay. Now, before we move on to the pants, I'm actually going to come through and brighten up some areas. Right, so just coming in here, making sure the areas that are in highlight are nice and bright. And just a little bit here because this is bulging up, so therefore that would be still catching the light here. And then having it taper as it comes this way. Okay, now he's certainly looking dapper. We'll get his legs and then stockings, and that shouldn't take too long. Legs are almost a little bit more straightforward because they're just straight down. We don't have the arms jutting out. But again, all edges are in shadow, and then you have the shadow that the belt's going to cast just a little bit. So right up by the belt, there's going to be some shadowing. Obviously shadowing just against the side here, and like anywhere that's dipping down, probably some shadowing, right? So this is dipping down. That would make this in shadow. All the way down. And on the back side, a bigger one than on the other side, also cleaning up these lines. But creating a nice big runway to differentiate that, we'll need to do kind of the same split that we did up there. And then it'd be bulging down into the fringe down here, so as it rounds under and bulges down, it would be casting some shadow. Of course, you have the edge of the pant leg as well, here into the other one, as this leg would be rounding in. Getting all of that. Okay, and then right by the belt. This won't be a deep shadow, but it will be there, so we don't want to push the highlight all the way to it, and I don't want, you know, there's a big gap of black here. Not necessarily what would be happening. Although you probably could if I decided the shadow was dramatic enough. So, some shadowing I'm going to do just kind of off the bat as you have these wrinkles coming down. That's of course twisting. You would have these wrinkles. So some shadowing through here. Gonna have some shadowing up and down, so it's gonna be kind of like that, play it by ear, just like we did up here. So you're gonna have that strong burst. I'm gonna allow that to go into a shadow. We're gonna push this up a little higher, so it won't be that bad. Push a bit into shadow over here. Pick back up on the strong burst and go back into shadow. Really does work nicely to do this though, this style, because of how, how we're drawing it. So we go back into shadow as it comes underneath, but there's still probably occasionally some spots that are picking up some highlight. Do that a little bit over here too. Same thing. Nice big burst. I'm going to have that go into a shadow here and then catch it again on the other side. So some of what I'm doing to help determine this is the way I've drawn these slices. The red underneath. How do they look? And do I think that means they would be picking up a highlight or not? And then this is rounding back down. This one I can see pushing down just a little bit more, but it is rounding over to the edge. So it would not be getting as much as it disappears. Alright, so we get a sense that there's some shadows and highlights, and then the same thing. I'm pushing it up a little bit more. Doing a little bit of a bulge down, a little bit of a bulge down there, where some of this would be probably poofing back up. And then we're starting to work our way to the other side, where that shadow would be kicking in. Probably would still be, though, a little bit over here. Yeah, you get a sense for the wrinkling, you can kind of see dips and bulges. Just like we did up there, I'm going to brighten up the areas that I didn't highlight so that it pops a little bit better. And maybe temper off some areas that are in shadow. Oh, and pull this up, because I didn't. Alright, so then we just have kind of this, fringe down here, which are just bulges. So that's somewhat straightforward in that, the top of the bulge is getting the highlight. Bottom of the bulge is not. But it still needs some shadow. Now this is a little bit lower. So it'd have less highlight because it'd be blocked. And then it rounds away, right? So you have that rounding into the other leg. Oh, I forgot some red here. The other leg picks up. And then it's rounding away. So rest of that kind of in shadow. We'll add some red as we need to fix that. Okay, now we have the stockings underneath. So there'd be a shadow being cast from the pants above, and it's bulging out, so that shadow is going to be a little bit more dramatic than it was with the belt. And then just, you know, that full pin pressure. So we get to the edge where that's distinctly going to be going into shadow as it rounds. And this back side, mostly in shadow, but there will be some highlight as it twists around. Right, so there's going to be just that little bit, but it's already kind of moving into shadow at this point as his leg twists around. Then over here, same thing. You know, that shadow cast by the legs going into that highlight. Pushing up roughly to the same spot, although the leg is turned differently. Alright, and then mostly shadow on the other one, but some highlight still there. Oh, that's a little too high. And then moving into shadow. Okay. Just to bring off some of this. I mean, great, but, you know, depends on how deep you want the shadow. How dark you make the dip. Okay. Now the red. We won't be adding a ton of highlight to the red, but we will be adding some, certainly here on the shirt. Right, this is going to have some highlighting. Going to have some shadowing. It's under the frill of that white. And then on the side closest to the light source over here, you'd have some shadowing cast by the clothes. But then you'd have some freedom here to brighten that up. And then on the other side as well. And here it would push all the way into the yellow, that highlight, because there wouldn't really be anything to block it. The direction of the highlight certainly wouldn't be doing it. I'd be pushing the highlight into the yellow. So it's going to go right up to that edge. Okay, so as we do the rest of the red, well, let me get down here. This will be a little bit more straightforward. Right, well, this is on the edge, so that edge in shadow. And then this would be shadowed much like the yellow was, where right up by it, it would have a shadow, and then as you get away from it, you're going to go into highlight. All the way to the same height that the highlight was on the yellow, and pushing that into the other as well as it rounds around. Alright, and then the same on the other one. You have that shadow, and then the edge is in shadow. But there's going to be a little bit of highlight right against the yellow before it goes back into shadow. And then same thing here, you have the shadow of the legs, make it a little less black right there, and then highlighting it in the same spots, right, kind of in that middle section down to the foot. And that's the stockings. So that's pretty straightforward. Rest of this, not so straightforward. Not hard. And I need to fill in some red that I missed here. Might as well do it while we have it. Okay. So not hard, but not, you wouldn't add a lot of highlighting. It's only going to be where the gaps are. So remembering that, you know, it's going to be blocked over here. So if it's going to get any highlighting, it's going to be on the opposite side. But even still, you're not going to get but so much. So it's going to be more sporadic, and you need to keep in mind the shadow pattern we already have with the clothing. So, you know, this might get a little bit through here and then down into here, but not much. Leaving the edges in shadow. Also completing the shadows, since I didn't. But not as much. Same through here, right? You'll have a little bit of highlight. Maybe a little bit up in here. But nothing big. So that leaves it to be underneath. And you don't want to do too much. And then as you're working with less space, see, I don't know, I think that already is a little bit too much. How am I going to be able to undo that? So we'll start this again. I might leave the more extreme shadows more than I was planning, because that's going to give it a little indication. See, I'll do a little bit here and not as much as I just did. And then same over here, a little bit. And then maybe a little bit. But not as much. That helps it show that it's underneath, tempering out that bright line I did here. Same thing. Because you can get too much too quickly for sure. And in theory, I wouldn't have to do anything to them because they are tucked behind, so they don't really need a whole lot to brighten them up. But that still kind of gives it the indication it's underneath, which is what we want. Now less space here, so it's now more of a matter of making it look even rather than brightening it up. And leaving the edges a little bit blacker, because I'm dealing with less space. That'll help indicate it's underneath. So not much, just adding a little bit here and there. Same over here. And then down in here in the pants. Yeah, so not much, which is nice and easy. You just add a few little bits of highlight to them. Should be enough to catch attention here or there. And then we'll do down here as well. And cleaning up those edges while I'm at it. All right, so that's his clothes, except I guess that white fringe. So let's get that done. Yeah. So the little white fringe, it's got, you know, kind of ups and downs to it. So right, you would have like a section facing light source over here, going into kind of more of a shadow on the other side, going into a section that's facing the light source, into a shadow facing the light source. So you have kind of that, you know, up and down going on. It's not even, but and it would probably be more even than what I've drawn it, but you know what? It's fine. We're going to leave it. I think it adds to this little guy's charm. As we come over, it's going to go more and more into shadow. Right? Only the tips would be in highlight. Because you have all of this that would be in shadow, blocked by the head as you come around. Yeah, there's his clothes. Fancy kitty. I'm gonna get the brown of the hat and the belt. First the belt. This won't take much. Right, this is just filling in all the gaps, making sure it's nice and even, highlighting it where it would be highlighted, leaving it in shadow where it would be in shadow. Of course, as it comes over here, it would definitely be fully in shadow, but filling in those gaps. But a little bit of highlighting. Of course, it's under the bulge of the shirt, so and then tapering it off as it comes over. So that's nice and quick. And then the hat here will have like an edge. And it's going to be rounding under, so a little bit of a highlight, but it's rounding underneath. And then this edge is behind the ear as it swoops down and then under the feather. So you might have a little bit perking up here. And then you have, again, behind that feather, behind a ton of feathers at this point. But you would have some highlighting hitting, even still. And then as you come over, this part of the hat is behind his head. So that's shadow. And you have the feather, a lot of things blocking it. So just sort of finishing it off. But otherwise, probably not very visible. Now, the feathers, the same yellow and red that the clothing was, so feathers, you know, can be pretty straightforward. I'm going to start over here where this tip is coming out. Right, so it's just kind of lines as the feather would be splaying out. This one gonna have some shadowing and some highlighting. Right, so it's coming off from that middle point. It's usually how feathers do. We have some shadowing as it comes down here. So backing up my pin pressure as I have that feather coming out. And it's behind the ear, so but up here still some highlight. Right, so some highlighting potentially there. So pretty straightforward. You just kind of have a middle line. It's probably going to be easier to demonstrate it here, right? You have kind of this middle line that comes up and around. And from there you have feathers coming off either direction on kind of an angle. And they don't have to be straight lines. They don't have to be, you know, any of that. And it'll still look like a feather. Just making sure it's nice and boisterous and filled in for the red and to help block how it would be. Right, it's a nice big boisterous loud feather. Trying to draw all my lines from that center point, but you don't have to completely, just as long as it looks like you've drawn all your lines from that center point, right? And it's okay if some of them aren't. And just sort of pulling it around, adding shadows, right? As we come over here, you know, over this way, the lines would be more in shadow. So backing off that pin pressure, towards the middle, they'll be more in highlight, but I find it easier to just do these in shadow and then to add that middle, you know, once we get it. So looping it over, even though this line, you know, it twists down. So, because this is the line following down. So the feather would twist off of that. So that's all there is to it for a feather. Pretty easy. Just follow the main line. And this would be in highlight. Because it's pushing forward, flopping forward. And then shadow over here. And then you can do a little bit more with it, right? So now we have it mostly drawn in. Now, let's give it some good highlights. It's nice and in front of the hat. So we want to make sure that it is clearly in front of the hat. And that we have the lines going the right way. Right, so we have these lines coming up. And then they were kind of going in. These are kind of coming up. And off that middle line, shorten off my strokes so they don't come all the way to the edge, but you would certainly be having some highlighting. And then behind, mostly in shadow, as this little feather kind of dips. Maybe a little bit of highlighting at the tip, but otherwise not so much. And then the red. Same thing. You have the feather coming down. So you have that middle point and all of the lines coming off of that middle point. And in highlight. But not as it comes back, and not on this other side. It's more in the middle and the edges, but here it's dipping under another feather, so loosen there. And over here, kind of a middle point, deciding wherever that was, since it's just the tip of a feather. And then making sure that's in highlight on the side of the light source. So and then middle point, so I always draw the middle point in. It helps me sort out what's what, where it is. And then we have the big feather sort of flopping over as it goes behind, which I might reverse the order of these layers so that the yellow's in front. Wouldn't make a huge difference necessarily, but it would make a little one. And then brightening up parts of this one. Right, you have that middle line. Some red under here. Most of this will probably be shadow. Making sure it's at least filled in. And then the last little flop of a feather. Middle point, and then the rest of this. Some of this will be highlight, some of it will be shadow. But it needs to be fully filled in and extravagant for a Landsknecht. And then giving some of the tip some highlight. Where it would be out from its shadow of the other one, potentially. Okay, but not fully. Maybe a little bit more. There we go. Alright, so that is how you draw sort of Renaissance style clothes. I hope that's helpful. In the floating nether next to me I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.